Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler. Coming up, we will review the week's top stories about the Democratic National Convention wrap-up and election integrity. Then the Center Square's Dan McCaleb and Jim Talamonte will further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. Elected officials and law enforcement leaders in Chicago have proclaimed that the 2024 Democratic National Convention was a successful one for the city. Jim Talamonte reports.
Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson says the 2024 DNC will go down in history as the example of constitutional policing.
These brave women and men show the world how we can maintain safety while protecting the people's right to protest.
Johnson said the convention was the best the country has ever seen. U.S. Secret Service Deputy Special Agent in charge of the Chicago Field Office Derek Meyer thanked Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling.
I've been in law enforcement for 24 years. I've traveled the world and I've lived in cities all over the country. I have never seen anyone better than you.
Officials did not address reports of overcrowding at the United Center, which prevented some delegates from entering the arena on the final night of the convention. I'm Jim Talamonte.
Meanwhile, Governor J.B. Pritzker used the spotlight at the DNC to highlight the successes of Illinois, but the president of a nonprofit think tank says the numbers just don't add up. Pritzker claimed that Democrats are champions of jobs, but as Wirepoint's President Ted Dabrowski points out, there are 85,000 fewer Illinoisans employed today than when Pritzker took office, and the state's unemployment rate is the second worst in the country.
We don't have business-friendly laws. Our pension debt is the biggest in the country, and it sucks up a lot of money, so that makes our economy worse. We have a lot of corruption, of course. We have too many units of government. All those things get in the way of companies doing what they do best, and that's hiring and growing.
Which leads to people leaving the state. Dabrowski notes that Illinois has had the third biggest loss of population since the last decennial count was completed in 2020, with a drop of more than 240,000 people. On the other hand, Texas and Florida gained more than 1 million in population over the 3 years. With elections coming down the pike, an Illinois election integrity advocate is raising concerns. Greg Bishop has that story.
Carol Davis is with the Illinois Election Integrity Program. She says legal fights continue to address the state's voter rolls. She says they're full of inactive voters. Her group got access to voter rolls last year and found nearly 1 in 10 registered voters are inactive.
People are parked on there that should not be on there. And of course, it opens the possibility that those names could be used by nefarious actors to cast vote-by-mail ballots.
Another legal front is working to limit counting in federal elections to Election Day, not up to 2 weeks after the election, as is allowed in Illinois. While a case challenging that in Illinois has been beaten, eyes are on a case in Mississippi where they have up to 5 days to count ballots.
Hoping that there'll be good outcomes there, that it will add strength when we come back to Illinois to try to hit that again.
I'm Greg Bishop.
Those are the top stories of the week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, the Center Square's Dan McCaleb and Jim Talamonte will further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Tired of being in the dark about what happens day to day under the dome in Springfield? Do you want to be more informed in the decision-making process? If so, you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch elected officials in action, holding them accountable, and having your say on issues that matter most to you. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to stay informed about Illinois state government and to be a more engaged citizen. Become a subscriber today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. closing the door on the Democratic National Convention that ended just a week ago. Chicago law enforcement took a victory lap for their security efforts, saying that thousands of protesters were allowed to practice their First Amendment rights mostly peacefully, with only a few unruly incidents. Greg Bishop has the day off, so joining me to discuss this is Jim Telemani, the Center Square Chicago-based reporter. Jim, welcome to Illinois in Focus.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here. It's nice to be in a little bit quieter setting after the craziness of the DNC that was going on last week.
I can only imagine. And Greg, who was on hand on the ground at the DNC, earned some well-earned time off, so we decided to give him the day. Jim, so you did cover the closing DNC press conference where Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson and Police Superintendent Larry Snelling said their officers did an outstanding job. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, this really was, no matter how you feel about the DNC and the show that it was, this was definitely a strong performance by the Chicago police. The superintendent, Larry Snelling, I've kind of seen him as a rising star for some time now. And Snelling was quick to credit throughout the whole process, very quick to credit his officers. He, in 2 days before that final press conference, he gave quite a detailed description of some of the abuse that his officers took from the protesters. Some of that was throwing objects, but a lot of it was just verbal vitriol. And he described in detail what female officers had to deal with. And he said he's very proud of his officers for not flinching, for not taking the bait. For the female officers, for taking it the way they did, and for the male officers for not, rushing in and to defend them, causing issues with protesters. So for the protesters who wanted violent confrontations, they really didn't get them. There were no serious injuries. And so it was really a strong moment for the Chicago Police Department and really all of the security apparatus in place. There certainly was some redemption here for the Secret Service in both Chicago and Milwaukee for the convention. The convention's going pretty much without major security issues after, obviously, what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania with the attempted assassination of former President Trump.
Right. Where they're facing widespread criticism and investigations into the assassination attempt on the former president and current Republican presidential candidate. You mentioned the insults and what some of the women officers faced. You do have to hand it to police officers who are there to secure these types of protests, whether it's at the Democratic National Convention or these campus protests that we saw in the spring, where protesters were protesting the war in Israel, pro-Palestinian protesters, oftentimes getting violent, certainly getting, verbally abusive of officers. When they're in their face, and you're having to deal with that kind of language and that kind of setting, yes, you're a trained professional. You have to be professional about it. And of course, an officer that pushes back, fights back, or whatever, that becomes a viral moment nationally. So I will step up, and I think all of Chicago and Illinois should step up and applaud how this went. Yes, there were dozens of arrests, but they, based on what we saw and reported on, the arrests were necessary. But Chicago police held their own, did not get out of control, and even the U.S. Secret Service Deputy Special Agent in charge of the Chicago office, Derek Mayfield, he also congratulated Snelling for the job he did. Final word on this, Jim?
Yeah, he not only congratulated him, he said, in my 24 years in law enforcement, I've traveled the world, I've lived in cities all over the country, and I've never seen anyone better than you talking to Snelling. So he, and again, really hard to disagree with anything negative at this point. Larry Snelling's come in and really done a nice job. There were some issues at the United Center. There was a breach of a fence, but that was not on police. This was set up ahead of time, and police quickly, however, took care of the situation. Nobody got into the United Center. On the last night of the convention, Chicago Fire tweeted that the building had reached capacity. There were reports of delegates not getting into the building or getting to their seats. Again, none of this was on police. I was surprised nobody asked Secret Service if people who weren't supposed to get in the building had gotten in. But I suspect this was just a matter of the DNC. Perhaps, everyone got checked going in, but perhaps some people were in on that final night who shouldn't have been. So it was overcrowded, and some of the early speakers on the final night, the Thursday night, actually had to leave after they spoke. They couldn't stay around to watch the Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, give her speech.
Well, shout out to you, Jim, and Greg Bishop, and the rest of the team that was in Chicago. Well, why don't we move on? After the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on public corruption laws earlier this year, the 4 lobbyists and utility officials convicted in the ComEd 4 trial, they're asking the judge to toss out their convictions and throw out the case altogether. Separately, longtime former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan, who faces 23 corruption-related counts when he goes on trial in connection to the same case in October, he wants prosecutors to be barred from presenting a whole bunch of evidence that they gathered against Madigan. Why don't we start with the ComEd 4 convictions, Jim? What's going on here?
Well, this is troubling, and Brett Roland's done some great reporting on this, that this is connected to a Supreme Court ruling on the federal bribery statute. So in June, the Supreme Court struck down part of this statute that makes it a crime for state and local officials to accept gifts valued at over $5,000 from a donor who'd previously been awarded contracts or other government benefits. So the ComEd people say, well, this clearly then isn't quid pro quo. Our case should be thrown out. There should be no conviction. And of course, any holes in this case, then, and this is connected to the Madigan case. So, for the good government types who've not just for months or years, but decades been trying to get Michael Madigan, brought in. And for the federal prosecutors who for so long investigated this could be really troublesome, in this case. And certainly if the ComEd group were to be freed, well, that would certainly open up some holes in the Madigan case too.
So sentencing in the ComEd 4 case hasn't happened yet. They were convicted well over a year ago, but the judge in the case delayed sentencing because of this anticipated U.S. Supreme Court ruling. The judge has not ruled on defendants' motion to dismiss the convictions against them and to throw out the case. We expect something to happen in the coming weeks or months in that case. But Madigan himself is set to set trial about a month before the November elections, and he's seeking to have tons of evidence that prosecutors against him have gathered against the longtime former speaker. Any thoughts on whether this could impact the trial date? I mean, it's already been Madigan's trial also was pushed back. It was supposed to be in the spring of this year, but because of this pending Supreme Court corruption ruling, it got pushed back to October. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, we saw this with another South Side Chicago politician, Ed Burke, where there was delay after delay after delay. Somebody on the defense team would get COVID, something, and so this is part of the tactical defense strategy. I suspect they're not going to admit that. But certainly in the ComEd case, the prosecutors are saying we don't need a new trial here, but there still hasn't been the next step forward. And so until that happens, you wonder if this case will move forward. And, and then so there's going to be every attempt possible by the Madigan team to delay, to prevent evidence from being brought in. So the more they can narrow this down, the more perhaps they can whittle down those 23 counts and put more question in the minds of the jurors.
And of course, Madigan also, as we talked about on Illinois in Focus in the past, and we reported at thecentersquare.com, there's a co-defendant in the case, Michael McLean, who there apparently have turned on each other in this case and want to blame the other. Each wants to blame the other, so they've asked for separate trials. That certainly could delay things even further.
Yes, exactly. And as you see things kind of, obviously the accounts are what they are. The federal prosecutors have said we have, but then again, you kind of see the team coming apart here. And that's certainly not good news. If the prosecutors are depending on McLean, or depending on people for testimony, and all of a sudden they're not reliable as they might have been, that certainly makes it a tougher case for prosecutors. And it gives Madigan another sense that there might be some kind of doubt here.
Next topic, Jim, since the pandemic, since since the murder in Minneapolis of George Floyd, you've seen an outbreak in violence in major cities and retail thefts, smash and grab thefts, things like that. The Center Square recently spoke to Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul, who explained the wide impacts of retail theft in the state. Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Attorney General started a task force in 2021, spending, and this is an annual spend now of $5 million on this task force to combat organized retail theft. This isn't just petty shoplifters coming in. And here in Chicago, we hear accounts from retailers all the time. People come in, take stuff and go, and it's a loss. But this is organized retail theft is different. This is coordinated. Sometimes it might be a smash and grab type operation, getting into a jewelry store with a team, and then that stuff's very quickly turned around from the people who take it to people who sell it on the black market, sometimes often online. And or it might even be theft of cargo from a truck or a train, and it's all planned and coordinated. So it's an organized, these are organized crime rings that get large amounts of retail goods and then resell them. And so the Attorney General, again, $5 million a year. So, well, why are we spending $5 million of taxpayer money for something we should be preventing? Well, the annual tax revenue loss is estimated to be $185 million in state taxpayer money. So if the task force does its job and is able to dig into that number, you can see the value from the Attorney General's point of view. But, in talking with people in the retail industry, this isn't just a loss issue in terms of goods. There have been nationally cases of violence where organized rings come in, they encounter a shopkeeper or a security guard, and there have been injuries and deaths. So that this isn't just victimless crime, so to speak. And even petty retail theft, you're talking about not just loss of goods and services of that retailer, but loss of tax revenue. And so everyone is impacted. But the organized thing, across the board, Attorney General and retail industry leaders all agree it's a growing problem. This isn't something that's, just a quick fad that happened during the pandemic. It's not just, the numbers are going up significantly.
Right. I just want to briefly go back to that $185 million in tax revenue that you cited. That comes from Capital One Shopping, but that's just the tax revenue, the state sales tax revenue that they said is lost due to it. I mean, companies, particularly smaller businesses, when there's rampant retail theft, that impacts their bottom line. That could impact jobs. That could, in fact, close particularly smaller businesses. We've seen across the country major retailers shutting down stores, largely in lower income communities where these things happen more frequently, I guess. So the wide community impact of this of these crimes, it can be felt by everybody.
Dollar General, just this morning, I read, had plummeting stock numbers. The retailers are really hurting, and this is a big part of it. This isn't just supply chain inflation. Part of the reason these prices are so high is the theft factor, and this is why public safety is such a big issue coming up in the November elections. It's not just the issue of personal safety, though I think for all of us, obviously the homicides and then the car thefts and then the assaults and all those kinds of things are the things that people fear the most. The effects of these retail thefts, organized and otherwise, on businesses, on the economy, on families, it's far-reaching, it's growing, and it's driving prices up. And so it's just making a more difficult world for everybody.
Now, it is late August, and most Illinois public schools are back. Students are back for the fall semester. According to your reporting, Jim, just 27% of Illinois public school students in grades K through 12 are meeting grade level standards in math, with about 35% meeting grade level standards for English and language arts proficiency. On top of that, the chronic absenteeism rate in Illinois public schools jumped to 28.3% in 2023. That's up from 16.8% in 2018. That means more than 1 in 4 students miss school at least 10% of the time. They just don't show up at school. As I mentioned, you wrote about it this week. Tell us more.
This, Dan, was the most stunning part of the whole Illinois education story to me. And looking over the Illinois report card, the Illinois Board of Education puts this out every year. We've known over the years, and especially since the pandemic, that academically, Illinois public school students have struggled. And public school students have struggled to recover from the pandemic, much more so than students in non-public schools. There's been a much quicker bounce back for kids in private schools, but in the public schools, it's been a struggle, and especially in math. I talked with Mariana Torres-Barragan of the Illinois Workforce and Education Research Collaborative, which is at the University of Illinois, and she said, especially high school students are really struggling, and math is a big problem. Well, part of the reason they're struggling is this chronic absenteeism. I mean, some of the numbers are absolutely staggering. And when you look at the districts with the bigger economic struggles, well, that's where the absenteeism is. East St. Louis, this is just stunning. 65% of East St. Louis School District 189 students have a chronic absentee rate. The 65%. The district is spending $25,000 per student in taxpayer dollars, so way more than the Chicago public schools, which are around $18,000, and that's a high number. So you wonder, perhaps if some of that money would go to actually get the students to show up, that maybe you'd see better academic results. Chicago's absenteeism rate, 40%. Again, 40% of Chicago public school students are missing at least 10% of the time. And in most cases, these are without, some of these, it could be with or without an excuse. So sure, you're going to have some medical cases, but right. On the other hand, a success story would be Effingham, where the absenteeism rate is 19%. Still not great. Again, you mentioned 16% pre-pandemic, but the spend per student there is under $10,000. So there's definitely better bang for the buck in Effingham and Carterville. But wow, the numbers are staggering, even statewide, even in quote-unquote successful public school districts. The absenteeism rates are through the roof.
And sadly, this impacts lower income communities more when COVID hit in 2020 and Governor Pritzker issued his stay-at-home orders, closing schools across the state. A lot of students, particularly from lower income families, they just kind of disappeared, might be too heavy of a word, but they stopped going to school. In many cases, maybe they didn't have strong internet connections at home, so they couldn't tune into the virtual learning classes, and then just never came back. So this impacts everybody, let's face it. I mean, students across the state are chronically absent, but it seems to be more in those lower income communities where these students they need that education so they can make better quality lives for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And you think of poverty in Illinois, you often think of Cairo and Polk County. And again, the numbers there are not good. And these are places, as you said, especially in places where you don't have the traditional family unit with two parents. During the pandemic, likely one of them would at least be at home, even if one was in a healthcare or law enforcement or one of those fields where they couldn't be. But when you have single parent homes, or maybe a home where both parents are absent and only grandparents are there, and you have the students that are already in a difficult situation, their situation got worse. Where there are engaged families, the losses were not nearly as bad. So a tough story.
Of course, this is not unique to Illinois, though. In terms of the chronic absenteeism, those numbers just seem outrageously high. But across the country, because of COVID, there was learning loss suffered by the students. I don't know how you get these students back to pre-COVID-19 testing scores and whatnot. Final word, Jim.
Well, the teachers' unions would say we need to spend more money. If we throw more money into but again, we see the districts where there's a lot of money spent per student, and even individual schools where there's more money. That's not what's happening here. So those throwing more money at the problem is not the answer. At least what the data shows us that it's not. So we just the model in Illinois, the public education model, needs a serious second look.
Jim, thank you for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with all of these stories and more at thecentersquare.com.